The penthouse stood tall against the city skyline, its polished windows reflecting a distant glow. Inside, all was chaos. The faint scent of cologne mingled with the unmistakable odor of blood. Dr. Vincent Aldrich lay sprawled on the marble floor, a pool of crimson around him. The elegance of the kitchen island, adorned with half-empty wine glasses, contrasted violently with the violence that had just unfolded. His life, once full of control and power, had been snuffed out in the place where he thought he was untouchable, his home. Nurse Elena Carter stood frozen, the scalpel clutched tightly in her hand, blood staining her fingers. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind swirling with disbelief. She hadn't meant for this. She never imagined it would come to this. But the reality of what she'd done was undeniable. The weight of the situation was crushing, her hands trembling as she looked down at the lifeless body at her feet. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, her mind screaming at her to wake up from this nightmare. But it was too late. A single scream had pierced the night, sharp and desperate. But now, only silence remained. The neighbors, uncertain and hesitant, hesitated before dialing the police. Their fear grew as the minutes dragged on, thick with tension. The sirens, growing louder, were the only sound breaking the quiet. The officers were on their way, their arrival imminent. Elena's fate was sealed, her quiet terror now mingling with the frantic wail of sirens drawing closer. Even in death, Vincent's voice echoed in Elena's mind. "You're mine, Elena. You were always mine." It wasn't just a memory. It was a living, breathing presence that suffocated her every thought. His grip on her was unrelenting, stronger than ever now that he was gone. His manipulation had burrowed so deep inside her, she couldn't escape his control, not even in death. His voice followed her like a shadow, a constant reminder of the man she could never escape. The door crashed open. Armed officers stormed in, their weapons drawn, shouting commands. Elena didn't move. She was frozen, numb. No attempt to run, no fight left in her. She held the blood-stained note with trembling hands, her lifeline to reality. The officers paused, exchanging glances, confused. Was she a victim or a murderer? The tension in the air was thick, a question that would soon be answered, but at what cost? The note trembled in Elena's hand, the ink blurred by blood, his and hers. Scrawled hastily, the words were chilling. This all started with love, and it ended in blood. The officers exchanged uneasy looks, unsure of what to make of it. Was she a pawn in a twisted game of obsession, or was she a willing participant? The answer was not clear, but Elena knew one thing. The man she had trusted had taken everything from her, including her soul. Elena's vision blurred as the past rushed back to her. A year earlier, before the obsession, before the lies, before the bloodshed. She had been a different woman then, innocent, unaware. But that all changed the moment Vincent Aldrich walked into her life. The flashback began, her fate sealed from the first touch. Elena Carter, dressed in scrubs, moved through the sterile corridors of St. Mark's Hospital, her feet heavy with exhaustion. She threw herself into her work, hoping it would drown out the ache in her heart. Every patient she helped, every life she touched, felt like a brief escape from the gnawing loneliness of her own existence. Her failed marriage haunted her every thought, and the mounting bills, both personal and professional, suffocated her. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer she could pretend everything was fine. But hope Hope felt like a distant memory. Dr. Vincent Aldridge ruled the operating room like a king on his throne. Every incision, every suture was performed with precise, methodical movements. His calm demeanor never wavered, yet behind his surgical mask was something darker, a thirst for control that no one questioned. He wasn't just a surgeon, he was a god in the eyes of his peers, deciding who lived and who died. His charm was magnetic, a smile that disarmed even the toughest critics. But Elena saw through his perfect facade. She could feel it, an unsettling presence that made her wonder if he was more than just a man. Dr. Miles Thompson had seen Vincent's darker side before, but Elena hadn't. He watched her grow increasingly enchanted by Vincent's attention and ignored at him. One afternoon, after a procedure, he caught Elena in the hallway, his voice low but urgent. "Watch him," Miles warned, his eyes intense. "Vincent isn't what he seems. He's dangerous." But Elena, wrapped in her need for validation, dismissed him with a nervous laugh. She didn't believe it, at least not yet. Detective Julia Monroe leaned against the cold metal of her car, staring at the hospital through the rain-soaked window. She'd tangled with Vincent Aldridge years ago, back when a patient had mysteriously disappeared after a routine procedure. The case was closed without answers, but Julia never let it go. Her instincts told her that something was off, that Vincent's charm was merely a mask hiding a far more sinister truth. She wasn't done with him, not by a long shot. Vincent's compliments began innocently enough, subtle praises on her professionalism, her beauty, her strength. Elena smiled each time, grateful for the attention that filled a space in her she hadn't realized was so empty. But soon, his words became more intimate, personal. "You're different, Elena. You're the only one who truly understands me." His gaze lingered, possessive, as if he was marking her as his own. Slowly, he began to make her feel special, indispensable, while subtly manipulating her into relying on him. She didn't see the trap closing in. She was too flattered by his attention to notice. When Elena's father fell critically ill, the weight of the medical bills crushed her. She was drowning, unable to keep up. One night, after a long shift, Vincent appeared at her apartment door, his presence unexpectedly comforting. "I can cover your father's bills," he offered, his voice smooth. "No one should have to choose between family and finances." Elena hesitated, guilt creeping in, but Vincent's smile was warm, convincing. "Let me help. You're doing everything you can." Reluctantly, she agreed. It seemed like a gift, until she realized it was more of a tether. His generosity came with strings she couldn't see. It started with small things. Vincent began asking where she was going, who she was seeing. "Just making sure you're safe," he'd say. But Elena's friends noticed the change, the way Vincent's shadow seemed to loom over every conversation. She brushed it off, convinced it was just his concern for her well-being. But in the back of her mind, doubts gnawed at her. Her independence was slipping away, piece by piece, and yet she couldn't find the strength to push back. A routine surgery went horribly wrong. A patient who was supposed to recover never woke up. The hospital staff was told it was an unavoidable complication, but Elena, who had witnessed Vincent's hand in the operation, noticed the inconsistencies, the deliberate actions that led to the fatal mistake. The whispers of unavoidable didn't sit right with her. She wanted to ask, to know the truth, but Vincent's influence held her back. His smile, cold and reassuring, kept her silent. Late one evening, As the hospital buzzed quietly with the ebb and flow of night shift chaos, Vincent pulled Elena aside. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "Some lives aren't worth saving," he said, his words sending a chill down her spine. "We choose who deserves a second chance." Elena's stomach twisted. She wanted to laugh it off as just another of Vincent's strange philosophies, but something in his eyes stopped her. For the first time, she wondered if she truly knew the man she'd fallen for. Elena's heart beat faster, not from excitement, but from the tightening grip of Vincent's love, his possessive love. Each smile, each tender touch was laced with a subtle warning. His eyes, always watching, never let her stray too far. She wanted to believe it was genuine affection, that his need to protect her was nothing more than a reflection of his care. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the creeping sensation that his love was just a mask for control. "I'm just looking out for you," Vincent would say, with a soft smile, as his hand gently cupped her face. "People are cruel out there, Elena. You can't trust anyone but me." His voice had a velvety smoothness to it, convincing her that his words were truth. But the world she knew, the friendships she once had, now felt like memories locked away in a faraway room, an existence that had no place in her life anymore. Her every move was calculated, each action weighed against his approval. She had once been independent, a woman in control of her destiny. Now, she felt like a bird in a gilded cage. One evening, as they sat together in his lavishly decorated office, Vincent casually leaned back in his chair, sipping his scotch with an unsettling calmness. "You know, Elena," he began, his voice unusually cold, "some people don't deserve second chances. They just keep messing things up. Some crimes are unforgivable." Elena paused, her fingers trembling around her wineglass. "What are you talking about?" His eyes darkened, a glimmer of something far more sinister flashing beneath the surface. "Just an observation," he said, his lips curving into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes it's better to act on your own terms. The law, it doesn't always get it right." The chill that spread down her spine wasn't just the draft from the window. She couldn't shake the unsettling weight of his words, but she laughed it off, trying to dismiss it as dark humor. "You always were a little extreme," she said, with a forced chuckle. Yet the seed of unease had been planted, and she couldn't forget the coldness in his gaze. Over the following weeks, Vincent's conversations with Elena took a darker turn. During a late-night dinner, he began to question the very fabric of hospital policies. His tone was measured, calm, almost hypnotic. "They're so obsessed with protocol, aren't they?" he mused. "Sometimes the system gets in the way of doing what's right. What if we could cut through the red tape? What if we could save lives in a more direct way?" Elena hesitated, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "What do you mean?" "Just think about it," Vincent continued, his voice low, persuasive. "We could make the tough calls, the ones no one else dares to make. I know you understand what I mean, Elena. You see the same things I do. Sometimes it's just about deciding who deserves a second chance, not waiting for a miracle." Her stomach twisted. He wasn't just talking about medicine anymore. He was justifying something much darker, but Elena couldn't find the courage to stop him. The unexpected death of a well-known hospital board member sent a ripple through the staff. He had been in for a routine surgery, and the next morning, Elena was told he had passed. Vincent had performed the operation. "I couldn't have foreseen the complications," Vincent explained to a grieving widow. with practiced sorrow. But you know, sometimes things happen. Elena watched, her stomach churning. The reports came in, but Vincent made sure everything was swept under the rug. The cause of death, a routine complication, nothing more. But the more she thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. Still, she kept quiet, unsure of what to do. Vincent's charming smile remained, as if nothing had happened. One afternoon, while going through paperwork in the hospital's back office, Elena came across something that made her blood run cold. Falsified prescriptions, dozens of them, all signed off by Vincent. The medications, opioids, were being stolen under the guise of special cases Vincent deemed worthy of treatment. Her hand trembled as she held the papers. "Elena, you look pale. Everything all right?" Vincent's voice came from behind her, but the warmth in his words felt colder than the documents in her hand. She quickly stuffed the papers into her drawer, but her heart was pounding. She knew Vincent was dangerous, his ethics twisted, but seeing the evidence in black and white left her paralyzed with fear. She had to act, but how? Elena tried to pull away, sensing the suffocating hold Vincent had on her. She began taking longer shifts at the hospital, hoping to avoid being alone with him. But Vincent knew. One evening, after a long day of work, Elena found a note waiting for her in her office. "They'll think you're complicit. You won't survive prison." The words felt like a punch to her gut. She crumpled the paper, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. He knew her secrets. He knew everything. And if she ever dared to turn him in, he would ruin her, just like he'd destroyed so many others. One night, as Elena scrubbed in for a late-night surgery with Vincent, she watched him operate with disturbing precision. There was no room for error, except there was no mistake in his actions either. As the patient lay under the bright surgical lights, Vincent's hand moved with deliberate, chilling intent. The patient's vital signs slipped away under the knife, and Vincent's gaze never wavered. Elena could hardly breathe. She tried to look away, but her eyes were glued to the scene in front of her. This wasn't a medical complication. This was murder. Her stomach churned, and she was paralyzed. There was no turning back now. Dr. Miles Thompson, a colleague Elena respected, had begun noticing the changes in her demeanor. He grew increasingly concerned, and one evening he pulled her aside. "Elena," he whispered urgently, "I know something's going on with Vincent. I've seen it before. He's manipulating you, twisting your mind. You have to get out of there." She felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly snuffed out by the look in Vincent's eyes the next time they crossed paths. The warning was clear. He knew she'd spoken to Miles. Vincent wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. When Miles was called in for a routine review, Vincent made sure that the evidence against him was undeniable. Fabricated records, falsified reports. Miles was accused of malpractice, his career destroyed in an instant. Elena watched as Miles's reputation crumbled, his medical license revoked, his future shattered. She knew what was coming next. She was next. One evening, Vincent took Elena aside, his expression unreadable. "Elena, you've been the best thing in my life," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I want you to be mine. Marry me." Her heart stopped, the walls closing in around her. This wasn't a proposal. It was a sentence, a lifetime of control masked as love. But she couldn't say no. Not yet. The darkness was closing in, and Elena felt trapped in a web of deception she couldn't escape. The truth was too dangerous, and the cost of defying Vincent was too high. There was no way out, at least not yet. Elena's hand shook as she fumbled with her phone under the table. The faint hum of Vincent's voice filled the quiet room. She had finally done it. She had recorded him. His voice was calm, almost detached, as he spoke to her, revealing the horrors he had hidden for so long. "I only did what needed to be done," Vincent's voice echoed through the device. "Some people don't deserve second chances. I gave them peace." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words press down on her chest. She could hear him justifying everything, the surgeries, the manipulations, the lives he had taken. Her fingers clenched around the phone as she whispered, "This is it. This is how it ends." It wasn't enough to just survive anymore. She had to expose him, and this was the evidence. Sitting in the dimly lit corner of their apartment, Elena's fingers flew across her phone, typing out a message to Detective Julia Monroe. She had to be careful. Vincent was always watching. "Detective Monroe, I have proof. Vincent is the killer. The tape is in the drawer, top left corner. Please, he knows I'm planning to leave. He's dangerous. If you don't get here soon, I might not make it." She paused, her thumb hovering over the send button. Fear gnawed at her stomach, a deep, unsettling sensation that Vincent had learned to exploit over the past months. But there was a shred of hope in her heart, a faint whisper that maybe, just maybe, she could escape this nightmare. Her eyes welled with tears. She sent the message and whispered, "Please, help me." Elena stood by the window, glancing out at the city below, her mind racing. She had packed a bag, enough to get her out of the country. But as she gathered the last of her things, a familiar sound made her freeze. The door opening. Vincent walked in, as calm as ever, his eyes scanning the room before landing on her. His smile, once warm, was now a cold reminder of the control he had over her. "You think you can just leave?" His voice was low, almost mocking. Her heart skipped. He knew. He always knew. Her eyes darted to the door, the faint hope she had of escaping slipping through her fingers like sand. "I was just getting ready to take a walk," she stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. Vincent's smile faltered, and in that moment, she saw it, the anger lurking behind his composed exterior. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with enough force to bruise. "Don't try to run from me," he whispered, his voice dangerously quiet. "You'll never escape, Elena." Later that evening, Vincent stood in the doorway of their penthouse, his face carefully neutral. "Elena," he said, his tone soft but calculated, "I think it's time we talked. One last time." Elena froze. She had seen this before. The manipulation, the sweetened promises masked by dark intentions. But she couldn't refuse him. The last part of her that believed he still cared, truly cared, begged her to go. "I don't want to argue anymore, Vincent," she said quietly, swallowing hard. I don't know what to say. I'm not asking for an argument, Elena. I'm offering you closure, a final goodbye," he said, his voice slipping into something almost tender, though it felt like a lie in her gut. Elena hesitated, torn between fear and an unexplainable need to know what Vincent had in mind. Vincent led her into the living room, where the dim lighting cast long shadows across the walls. He turned toward her, his eyes soft, yet calculating. "Elena," he said, his voice low and seductive, "I did what I had to. You know that. All those people, they needed to go. They were broken, and I saved them. I saved us. Without me, this world would be chaos." She tried to steady her breathing, forcing herself to look him in the eyes. "You murdered them." Vincent chuckled softly, stepping closer, his hand brushing against her cheek. Murder? Number I gave them peace. I'm the only one who can see through the mess the world has become. Her body tensed, but something in his gaze made her falter. Could he really believe that? Was this just a twisted justification, or did he truly think he was saving them? You don't have to justify this anymore, Elena whispered, her voice shaking. I'm not like you. He leaned in, whispering softly, But you are, Elena. Deep down, you're just like me. I've made you strong. I've shown you how to see the truth. Vincent's voice lowered to a whisper as he pressed his lips to her ear. Do you know how many people I've saved by deciding who deserves to live? Elena's stomach churned, her entire body going cold. She pulled away from him, suddenly more aware than ever of the chilling reality before her. There was no escaping this. Vincent wasn't a man who had made mistakes. He was a man who had built an empire on lies, death, and control. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. This isn't love. This is control, obsession, and pure evil. She tried to stand, but Vincent grabbed her wrist, yanking her back. You'll never understand, he said, his voice tight with something that could have been rage. You'll never be free from me. Elena's pulse quickened as she struggled to break free from his grip. Panic set in, her hands trembling as she fought against his hold. But Vincent's strength was overwhelming. He pressed her back against the wall, his breath hot on her neck. You're mine, Elena, he hissed. You always will be. Desperation flared inside her. She had to fight. She had to survive. Her eyes locked on the nearby counter, where the scalpel lay. A tool that had once saved lives, now turned against its master. In a flash, she grabbed the handle and swung it at him, the blade cutting into his arm. Vincent stumbled back, a flash of shock crossing his face, but it quickly turned into fury. You're not leaving me, he growled, advancing once more. Vincent lunged, his hands reaching for her throat, but Elena was ready. In a swift, desperate motion, she thrust the scalpel deep into his chest. The force of the blow shocked him. His eyes widened, and he staggered back, blood spilling onto the floor. He collapsed in front of her, his body going limp. You'll never be free from me, he gasped, his voice weak, but still filled with that twisted sense of superiority. Elena watched him take his final breath, the words hanging in the air long after he was gone. Her hand trembled as she pulled away from the scene, blood staining her fingers. She was free. Finally, she was free. But in that moment, as Vincent's twisted smile lingered in her memory, Elena realized one harsh truth. Even in death, he had never truly let her go. Detective Julia Monroe stood at the threshold of the penthouse, her eyes sweeping over the carnage that surrounded her. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and the lifeless body of Vincent lay sprawled on the floor, his twisted grin still etched across his face. Elena was on the couch, her body trembling uncontrollably, clutching the blood-stained note in her hands. The officers moved cautiously around the room, whispering to one another, but their glances toward Elena were full of doubt. Monroe approached Elena, her voice soft but firm. Did you defend yourself?" she asked, her eyes not leaving the woman's fragile form. Elena nodded, her voice barely audible. "It was him or me?" The officer standing nearby spoke up, his tone uncertain. "Murder or self-defense?" Monroe didn't respond immediately. She watched Elena carefully, knowing that whatever had transpired here had cost this woman everything. Hours later, Detectives scoured Vincent's personal files, each one more disturbing than the last. Beneath layers of falsified reports, they uncovered the depth of his manipulations. Dozens of manipulated deaths, all disguised as medical failures or tragic accidents, and all overlooked by the very institution that had trusted him. It was as if Vincent had been playing God, selecting who lived and who died. One investigator, flipping through pages, stopped at a name. This is one of the families that reported a missing loved one, he said, his voice tight with disbelief. Keep going, Monroe instructed, her voice low, haunted by the growing list of victims. We need to expose every one of them. As the files piled up, the horror of what Vincent had done began to take shape. Each name, each tragedy, a grim piece of the puzzle. But the real question was how he had hidden his crimes for so long. The city was in shock. The news was everywhere. Respected surgeon found dead in penthouse. His secret life exposed. The headline screamed, the air filled with rumors. Families of Vincent's patients flooded the hospital, demanding justice for the lives that had been cut short under his care. How could this happen? One woman cried out, her voice shaking. He was supposed to save my husband. He was supposed to help us. The media swarmed, their cameras flashing, as they painted Elena in a corner. Was she an accomplice? Was she a prisoner of Vincent's twisted mind games? Or had she been complicit in his reign of terror? Elena's face flashed across the screen in a grainy photo from the hospital. Her eyes, once full of hope, now reflected nothing but despair. The accusations hung over her head like a noose. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Elena sat at the defendant's table, her hands trembling as her lawyer whispered reassurances that didn't ease the knot in her stomach. The prosecution was relentless, painting her as a willing participant in Vincent's madness. They spoke of her knowledge of his crimes, of her proximity to his dark acts, and how she had never come forward. But Detective Monroe was there, standing on the side of truth. She leaned forward, her voice cutting through the heated exchanges. Vincent manipulated, he controlled, and he trapped Elena in a psychological prison. She fought to survive, and that's what she did. Survive. The defense attorney stood beside her, nodding. What we see here is not guilt, but the scars of a woman who has been abused, whose life has been shattered. The courtroom was divided. Some saw Elena as a victim, others as a criminal. The jury watched closely, but it was the truth that had to prevail. In the end, Elena was cleared of all criminal charges. She had survived the battle, but it had cost her more than just her career. It had cost her soul. The damage was done. The world would never see her the same way again. She walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the verdict heavy on her shoulders. No hospital would hire her now. Her name, once synonymous with hope and healing, was now forever linked to a maniac's twisted games. As she stood at the edge of the street, the distant sound of traffic filled her ears, but it was all a blur. Vincent's voice echoed in her mind, the chilling final words he had whispered before he died. You'll never be free from me. Her chest tightened, but she swallowed the pain. She wasn't sure if she would ever truly escape his grasp. But one thing was certain. She would never return to the life she had known. The price of survival was too high. And yet, as she walked away, she knew that in surviving Vincent, she had taken the first step toward finding peace. Elena sat in the small, dimly lit apartment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She thought back to the first time Vincent had made her feel special. His soft words, the way he looked at her with such intensity, as though she was the only woman in the world. She had been naive then, convinced that love could conquer anything. But it wasn't love. It was control, a carefully crafted illusion. Each compliment, each touch, was a step in a game she didn't even know she was playing. And when she finally saw through the facade, it was already too late. Could I have stopped him sooner? The question haunted her, gnawing at the edges of her mind. If she had just spoken up, would it have ended differently? The realization hit Elena like a punch to the gut. Monsters don't always look like monsters. They don't have fangs, or red eyes, or claws. No, they look like Vincent. Charming, polished, well-respected, someone you'd trust with your life. And for years she had trusted him, fallen for his sweet promises, only to learn that they were nothing more than bait. She couldn't shake the warning that echoed in her head, the words that now seemed so painfully clear. Evil doesn't always come with fangs. It sometimes whispers sweet promises. Vincent had whispered those promises every night until they became suffocating chains that had bound her to him. Elena left the hospital behind. Her career, once her pride, now lay in ruins. No hospital would take her now, not after everything that had been exposed. She walked away, not to heal, but to survive, to learn how to live with the scars Vincent had left on her soul. The city felt foreign to her, a blur of unfamiliar faces and empty streets, but there was a strange sense of freedom too. No longer confined to the life she once knew, Elena found herself staring at a blank canvas. What would she paint now? Could she ever trust again? But one thing was clear. She would never let anyone fool her again. As she settled into her new life, Elena found herself in a new hospital, in a new city, trying to put the past behind her. But as she walked through the halls, something caught her eye. A doctor, charming and suave, his gaze lingering just a little too long on a young nurse. Elena stopped in her tracks. The pattern, the cycle, it was repeating itself. The subtle flirtations, the way the nurse blushed, the doctor's charisma, so like Vincent's, the whispers of control, disguised as affection. She felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen this before. Would anyone believe her if she warned them? Or would they think her paranoid? Her final thought echoed as she walked away, the weight of her past never far behind. We always think we'll recognize evil, but sometimes it looks like love.